cyberspace. My name is Garrett Mills, and this is going to be the first in a series of PHP tutorials where I'm just going to walk through from the basics of PHP to developing a more complicated, robust PHP web application. So we're going to jump right in here. However, the prerequisites is that you have a working PHP development environment installed on whatever operating system you're using. So I'm currently running in Ubuntu, which is a version of Linux, which is something not everybody's heard of, but the standard software is the same across all three platforms, Mac, Windows, and Linux. And so if you don't have a working development environment, you can click the I in the top right hand corner to go to my playlist and select your operating system, where I have a tutorial for setting up PHP development environment. So the first thing to do when we start a new project, obviously, is to create the project files. So I'm using PHP Storm paired with Scotchbox. However, if you followed the setup tutorials for setting up a PHP development environment, you could be using Eclipse, you could be using Examp, some combination of the two. The basic process and the code itself is going to be the same. However, your buttons might look a little different. So I'll try to make accommodations for that as we go. So in PHP Storm or Eclipse, you're going to want to hit Create New Project and then name it whatever. But be sure that it's going to save into the directory where your server is running things from. So in my case, I'm using Scotchbox, so I want it to be the public folder / the name of my project. So we're just going to call this PHP Tutorial 1. I'm using PHP version 7, hit create, and it's going to load up the project and drop us in our editor. So to double check that our project is set up right, we can just create a new file in here and name it anything. So we're just going to name it index.php. And now we're going to just throw out a little bit of HTML. So, since this PHP file doubles as HTML, we can check that it's working by navigating to our development server and then going to the project root, so PHP tutorial 1. And we should see that hello world. If you see this, it means that PHP files are being properly handled and served in the right directory. If for some reason you can't get this to work, make sure that you've got your folder in the public root of your server and that the name of the folder in your URL matches the name of the folder in your file system. So in our quest to learn PHP and understand how it works, there are a few important fundamentals to understand. The first underlying fundamental that you have to know to develop PHP is that the entire purpose of PHP and the entire purpose of PHP files is to output HTML. PHP, the entire job of it running on the server, is at the end of all of the scripts and all of the processes, it wants to be left with an HTML file, a static HTML file that it can send to the client. And so all PHP files is HTML files with some special bits in them. So that's why we can type just normal HTML. It's also important to understand how the flow, the back and forth between the user, so in our case that would be me getting on Firefox and typing in the website, and the server, in this case Scotchbox or whatever Examp, that's sending the files. So there are a few steps in this. The first thing that happens when I hit enter is my computer, my web browser, sends a request to the dev.local server, which is my development server. That request is always formatted the same, and it has standard sets of variables and types telling PHP, my development server, that I am looking for the file that is the main file for the folder PHP tutorial 1. The next thing that happens after the request is sent is obviously the server receives that request. So All the development environment tutorials I use and that I created use the web server Apache. It's just the name of the program that is the web server. Apache receives this request, and it goes and finds the PHP file under the PHP tutorial 1 folder. So in our case, that's under public. It goes to this PHP tutorial 1, and it finds index.php. Then it looks at the ending of the file. In this case, it's a PHP file. So Apache sends this file to PHP, the interpreter. That's this PHP command line program on the server. And the server runs through the PHP file and executes all the code in it. And it formulates what's called a response. A response, like a request, is a communication between the client and the server. In this case, it's what the server sends to the client, or Firefox. That request asks the server for a file. The response contains headers also. It contains a response code, and it contains the HTML data for the browser. The browser, or the client, receives that response, and then it renders it into the title and HTML data that we see and interact with on our computer. So that's important to understand, because it's sometimes important to understand where in that flow things occur. So the PHP occurs after the request is received by the server, and the PHP is executed on the server. So jumping back over to our text editor, we're ready to finally start getting into the code. So as previously mentioned, PHP files are nothing more than HTML files. So we can use our basic HTML scaffolding, and we're going to take a look at a new tag that is exclusive to PHP, and it looks kind of funny. It's a normal tag, but it's got a question mark, and it says PHP. So inside this tag, which when closed looks something like this, inside this tag is where you write PHP code. So you have this opening and this closing. Anything inside of this tag is going to be interpreted by the server as PHP. So we can do things like basic scripting. So let's say we want to print out a head that says welcome visitor. Well, we can tell PHP to echo some HTML code, h1 hello visitor. And so what this is going to do is when the request gets sent to the server and the server executes the PHP in this file, it's going to go down looking for this PHP tag. Once it finds it, it's going to grab all of this inside this tag, and it's going to execute it. And it's going to see echo this string, and then it's going to put that string in as though it were just HTML. So now, if we go here and look, hello visitor, and if we look at our page source, you can see we don't see that PHP tag because it gets executed on the server. We just see the bit that PHP exported into the string that gets sent to the client. Now that's not terribly interesting, and it's no more efficient than if you just type out hello visitor. What PHP is really good for is dynamic changes. So let's say we can do cool things like setting variables. So variables in PHP begin with a $sign. All variables have to. So let's say we want the visitor's name. So we can say variable name equals Robert. Terminate it with a semicolon. Most PHP statements are terminated with a semicolon. So what this allows us to do is it allows us to have dynamic changes, dynamic applications, and it allows us to quickly write flexible HTML. So you can see once it gets to here, it's going to echo hello, comma, space, and then it's going to go get the value for name, Robert, and put it in there. So now, if we go here, hello, Robert. And if we view the page source, there we go. And so I can quickly change this to any name I want, and it changes. So, takeaway for today, variables in PHP start with a $sign. Another thing we can do is we can have lists. So, say people in a class. We can make lists. So, Violet, Robert, Will, Owen, etc. These are initiated and terminated with square brackets, and they behave just like you would expect a list to. So we can say class 3. And that's going to go 0, 1, 2, 3. And so now if we go here, it all works. So just some basic writing out variables and using them to export HTML. Now that's not all terribly interesting. What if instead we could have it based on the URL? So say we had a variable defined in the URL. So something that you might have seen before is if you have a question mark and then some variable. So maybe name equals Owen. This bit here is usually specific to PHP, but there are other interpreters that use it. What this is saying is this question mark denotes that it's a special string separate from the rest of the URL, and then every set of these is a set of variables that PHP maps to a variable that you can access. So you can have URLs passing data to your server, and based on what the URL is doing, can change the kind of page that the user sees. Now earlier, I talked about how in PHP, the server receives a request from the client, and that request is always formatted the same. It has variables, it has headers, and it has other data talking about what page the client wants to see. And what PHP does with this request is it parses it and it turns it into a bunch of different variables that we can access. So variables that PHP defines for us that we use begin with an underscore. So you can see we've got cookies, the environment, files, get, post, request, server, session, etc. So the one we want to look at is get. Get is a variable defined by PHP, and it's a list like the class variable that we made earlier. And what this is for GET requests, which is one of the different types of requests. We'll talk about this more later, but suffice it to say that GET requests are when the web page or when the web browser is requesting information from the server, and a POST request is when it's sending information to the server. So this, in this case, is a GET request. We are asking for the page at this location, and attached to that are these variables. So they are GET variables. So they get added into this list underscore GET. So what we can do is say we want it to customize the welcome message based on what the name is. Well, we can tell it to echo hello, and then we're going to leave a blank spot there, so we'll just put name for spacing and terminate it. So what we want is we want this bit to show up here. So what we can do is make this two separate strings, and in PHP the way you concatenate strings is with a dot. So in JavaScript, for instance, if I wanted to connect hello and world, I would just put a plus sign between them. And this tells JavaScript to treat these like one string. In PHP, what we do is we use a dot. It's basically the same thing, but it connects the strings together. So in here, we also want the name. So we access that GET list, and then in that list, we want a variable called name. So what this is going to do is when this is executed on the server, it's going to check the URL for any get variables, and it's going to attach them to this list. Then we're going to find the variable for name, so in this case Owen, and we're going to insert it here to welcome our guests by name. So now if we hit enter, we see the name, and I can change this. So say Garrett, my name, and it changes dynamically. So this is a fundamental principle of PHP, the ability for the client to see a different page based on the data that the server gets. So this is just some basics for getting started with PHP. We've built a basic web app that welcomes users by name, and we've gone through what PHP files are, how they're served on the server, and how to access them properly via the web browser. So another thing that you may have noticed I did a lot when debugging or just verifying my code is I hit view page source, and this lets me look at the raw code. This is super useful sometimes because say I've got a bug here and this isn't outputting the right thing, right? So say I refresh and you'll see I get PHP errors. PHP will tell you what's wrong. So you see, notice undefined index named on line 9. So I come in here, I go to line 9, this is the variable, this is the index, and you see that named with a D is undefined. So I change it and I fix it, and there we go. So PHP is going to give you debugging errors, so it just helps you fix your code. Now obviously you won't see those in production servers. That way your clients and like your professional users don't actually see any bugs as they show up. But when you're developing, it's important to be able to figure out what bugs are line by line and just see different types. So for instance, if we leave out a semicolon, which is surprisingly common, it doesn't really do anything for just one line, but say we have another line after that, and we leave out the semicolon there, we're going to see a parse error, unexpected echo, expecting comma or semicolon on line 11. So we find 11, and we can see it wasn't expecting to see the word echo there. So we go back and look at what's before it, and we see that we're missing a semicolon. Now another thing that you may have just noticed right now as I'm doing this is because I'm using an actual IDE, not just a text editor like Notepad, it gives me syntax parsing live. So if I have another command, you can see this space over here turns red, and if I hover over it, it'll show you expected semicolon. It was looking to find a semicolon there, and so this lets us quickly debug errors in the text editor before we even deploy the things. So that's all we're going to really cover in this just getting our feet wet introductory video. It's just showing us some basic PHP fundamentals. Obviously this course is going to assume you have a working knowledge of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, although we won't really be using those latter too much, but it does require you to have a pretty working understanding of HTML. Okay guys, thanks for watching this first tutorial. I know it was a little basic, but I promise we'll get into some more advanced stuff next time and as we progress through the series. I'll be down in comments, so be sure if you have any questions or problems or concerns, feel free to ask, or if you just create a really cool project and you want me to see it, share it with me down there. I'd love to see what you guys are working on. Also, feel free to connect with me on Twitter, on email, on my blog. Those are all linked in the description, and as always, don't forget to subscribe for more coding tutorials, as they are sure to come. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.